Well, that will depend on the position.
We're looking at live pictures from inside the courtroom right now in the George Zimmerman murder trial. That's Rich Manti, one of the state prosecutors, who is questioning Daniel Schumacher on this animation that he created. The defense really wants this animation to be shown to the jurors. The jurors are not in the courtroom right now. It shows a recreation of what happened between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. The prosecution doesn't want this to be shown. They're arguing it's strictly speculative, if you will. The judge's got to make a major decision on this momentarily, so we'll stand by for that. We'll continue our monitoring of what's happening in this discussion. Meanwhile, one of the nation's most respected experts on gunshot wounds appeared to do some considerable damage today to the prosecution's second-degree murder charge against Zimmerman. Dr. Vincent DeMaio literally wrote the book on forensic pathology. We're told jurors seemed riveted by this crucial defense witness, a grandfatherly figure who explained the scientific evidence in layman's terms. He testified in great detail about Trayvon Martin's bullet wound and his now famous hoodie, that sweatshirt that he was wearing. He says the evidence is consistent with Zimmerman's account that Martin was leaning over him when he shot him. Listen to this.
If you lean over somebody, you will notice that the clothing tends to fall away from the chest. If instead you're lying on your back and somebody shoots you, the clothing is going to be against your chest. So that the fact that we know the clothing was 2 to 4 inches away is consistent with somebody leaning over the person doing the shooting, and that the clothing is 2 to 4 inches away from the person firing.
You may consider in your opinion as well that the clothing was wet. Mr. Martin's shirt was described as being damp, that it had been raining that night, and that when it was photographed at the medical examiner's office the next day, it was obviously wet in places. You may also consider that the responding officers found an unopened can of a beverage in the front pouch of Mr. Martin's hooded sweatshirt. This is in evidence as Exhibit 148, an unopened 23-ounce can of a fruit beverage.
Yes.
Do you find those facts consistent with what you saw, as well as consistent with what Mr. Zimmerman said happened?
This would tend to reinforce, because the reason that the clothing, as you bend forward, the clothing falls away from the body is gravity. Now, if you have wet clothing, clothing's heavier, and there's going to be a greater tendency to fall. And if you have something in the front pulling the shirt down as you lean over, again, it tends to pull away from the body. So the wound itself, by the gap, by the powder tattooing, of contact of the clothing indicates that this is consistent with Mr. Zimmerman's account that Mr. Martin was over him, leaning forward at the time he was shot.
It was just one of several key moments in Dr. DeMaio's testimony that supported Zimmerman's claim that he shot Martin in self-defense. Let's bring in our panel. The defense attorney, Jose Baez, is joining us. Also joining us in Sanford, Florida, our legal analyst, the former federal prosecutor, Sonny Hostin. Also, our CNN legal correspondent, Gene Cassar. Looks that testimony was pretty strongly in favor of the defense. Jose, how important was it?
It's extremely important for one thing, and that is that this trial has moved into a direction of who was on top, whose voice is that. Wolf, I know Vince DeMaio. I've worked with him. His book on gunshot wounds is the Bible when it comes to gunshot wounds, and it's used by every forensic pathologist across the country. So what this man says is extremely important, but the fact that he said it's consistent with isn't necessarily definitive, but the way the lack of cross-examination from the prosecution on this issue really gave it a lot more weight than it could have been. It still doesn't answer the initial question, which was who was the initial aggressor, who started this fight. The fact that at a certain point Mr. Zimmerman was on the bottom, I don't necessarily, I wouldn't say it was a home run, but it certainly is powerful testimony.
Did the prosecutors do a good job, Sonny, in cross-examining this witness, Dr. DeMaio?
I think so. I mean, you certainly, a witness like this, a world-renowned expert who wrote the book on forensic pathology, or rather on gunshot wounds, you don't cross-examine that type of witness on his credentials, because you can't. What you do is you change the narrative, and that's what this prosecution did. The defense wants this case to be about who's yelling and who's on top, because their case is about self-defense, about justifiable force. Now, of course, the prosecution's case is about second-degree murder. Their case is about who started this fight, because if George Zimmerman started the fight, then bottom line is, you know, self-defense becomes a bit trickier for him, because he's got to meet other prongs. He can't just say, oh, I shot in self-defense. And that's what the prosecution did coming right out of the gate. He said, you're not testifying about who threw the first punch, are you? And Dr. DeMaio said no. And you're not testifying about who started this fight. No. And that's what the prosecution needed to do. And so they got that. They also got him to concede a couple of points that I think are going to be very helpful. In fact, he said that he doesn't trust eyewitness testimony because they're always wrong. I think that really hurt the defense's case. And I also think it was very helpful for the prosecution that he did concede that Trayvon Martin could have been backing away. That shows that perhaps George Zimmerman wasn't in reasonable fear of dying and didn't exhaust all means to get away, which he would have to do to prove self-defense if he started the fight.
What was it like, Gene, inside the courtroom during Dr. DeMaio's testimony? You were inside there, and I know you were looking, you kept a close eye on those 6 women who were in the jury.
I did. You know, every time you're in a courtroom and one of the renowned experts of this country takes the stand, I mean, it's nothing but riveting, because you listen to what they're saying, you listen to their credentials. And the jury, I believe, was very, very fascinated, just watching, listening, taking notes up and down with their heads, looking at his demeanor, taking the notes. I think very important, one thing he testified to was that he believes there are 6 separate impacts to George Zimmerman's head. And that's important if one is reasonably in fear of imminent death. He said there were 2 lacerations, as we've seen, on the back of his head. What he said, though, as contrary to other medical examiners, was that it was from 2 different impacts to the head, because there was a deep valley between the 2. And then there were 2 abrasions, one on either side of the head, 2 more impacts. His nose, he said, was displaced to the side because there was so much swelling. It was so huge in that initial photo. And then a few hours later, the swelling was down. He believed that somebody placed that nose back in the position it should have been. And then the last injury, he said, was to the forehead, a punch to the forehead of George Zimmerman.
All right, everyone stand by. We're going to continue to monitor what's happening in the courtroom right now. The judge has to make a very important decision on an animation that may or may not be allowed to be shown to the jurors. We're also looking closely at how the prosecutor tried to use the defense's forensic expert against them. We're standing by for new information from federal investigators